So thank you. Thank you for having me, Professor Balaganapati Garu, and the Department of Philosophy. It's been long association with you, Professor, from the days of MA and PhDs in Hyderabad. I was at Usmania, of course, and you were at Hyderabad Central University. Our career graphs, took so many turns, but yet this association is still flourishing. Thank you. Professor Shashi Matlaji is there. It's nice to see you, and other colleagues of your department and students and scholars. This topic, understanding consciousness, and J. Krishnamurti, the idea is that I'll speak a little bit on consciousness from the Vedanta perspective, and then I'll get into J. Krishnamurti, whatever these days the chapters that I'm reading. I'll just pick up on the methodologies for today's deliberation. Both I'll look into Vedanta methodology and J. Krishnamurti, their approach to understand nature, structure, and content of consciousness. The second slide says consciousness explained. It has to be audacious to say that somebody can explain consciousness. That's not a proper term to use, but still every effort is to try and understand consciousness. Understand in Sanskrit what we call as chit. One interesting anecdote is Professor Jain Mohanty writes in his contribution to phenomenology and Indian philosophy. Gadamer, in one of the seminars following Heidegger, raised the question whether there are consciousness studies outside the Western academia. By that he meant the Europe and American continents. And of course, Professor Mohanty says it took him 3 days of the seminar to explain that there are consciousness studies, and Asia did take lead in consciousness studies, minimum 3,000 to 3,500 years before, right from the Rigvedic times. So the studies into chit and trying to define were all attempted in the Upanishads, and if we see the later literature also, Bhagavad Gita, followed by then Brahma Sutra. We have commentaries, 2 traditions of Bhamati and Vivarana of Vachaspati Mishra and Padmapada. And then you have Bhaskara's commentary on Brahma Sutra, you have Ramanuja, Vallabha, Yadava Prakasha, including the Vijnana Bhikshu of the Bengal land. So all this tradition took up the task of...
Professor Nataraju, sorry to interrupt you.
Please,
I'm getting comments from the audience that your voice is breaking.
Okay. Could
you bring the mic nearer? Maybe if you want, you can maybe switch off the video for a little while. Then quality may improve.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes,
Thank you.
I did this. Yeah.
Thank you.
Now I believe it must be a little better. Yeah. So
I think the problem is with the connectivity, Professor Nataraju. You check the connectivity once so that it would be better.
Okay. Now that the video is switched off, I believe this is a little better.
Yeah. Please
okay. So I was trying to look into the tradition that see the Gadamers or the Heideggers understanding that are there consciousness studies. Though this talk is not meant to get into this one, we still can refer back to the times of Kapilacharya's Sankhya Sutras, where there is a clear distinction between Purusha, the conscious principle, and then mind, Mahat, Ahankara, Tanmatras, and then Indriyas. From the times of the Kapila, the distinction is made that there is something much more than the psychological states, much more than the psychological condition. There is something else that is present within the humans and in the cosmos as well. And Upanishads have been very clear about a principle which transcends senses, mind, intellect, etc. So, of course, getting back, as I said, the next 35 to 40 minutes, I'll look at the methodologies adopted, as I strongly believe that what we need to do is one part of philosophy, what Shankara said, what Wittgenstein said, what Kant said, as we all know, is one way of doing what to think. But how to think interests me more. How is it that someone like Husserl arrives at the whole thesis of a transcendental subjectivity? How is it that Shankara arrives at the unity of individual consciousness and the cosmic consciousness, Atman and Brahman, Jivatma, Aikyavada? All that interests me. So therefore, if we can look at the methodology, how to do and how to think, I'll just have today. I'll refer to the Vedanta and then try and connect with Krishnamurti. In Krishnamurti, I see a parallel thinking, of not following the tradition, because Indian philosophers and thinkers have been criticized of, quoting the text more than what is necessary, and where Shabda plays a vital role in our understanding of consciousness, and people keep quoting the Bhamati or Badarayana Brahma Sutra. So that's been more fashionable. So therefore, the criticism is that you are falling too much back onto the help of the scriptures, the exegetical studies. So therefore, Krishnamurti comes across, we come across Krishnamurti with a refreshing air. He keeps saying that I did not read Bhagavad Gita or the Upanishads just to stay away from the kind of beliefs that they create. And in him, we also see, the questioning of tradition, questioning of authority, questioning of the texts. So free-minded play in approaching consciousness studies. So that's what makes me interested in him. Though I can assure you that I'm a typical follower of the Vedanta tradition, rooted to Sanskrit studies, and I believe in that. And then I also believe that within the tradition there is such a freedom for creative thinking and for innovative methodologies to be adopted. There is always that freedom within a tradition. Though rooted to the tradition, yet I appreciate the kind of work that Krishnamurti does. So if we look at the methodology, we have Avasthatraya Vichara and Panchakosha Vichara in order to understand nature of consciousness. Panchakosha Vichara and Avasthatraya Vichara, we have it in the Kathopanishad with Nachiketa and Yama dialogue of waking state consciousness, the Vaishwanara, and the dream state consciousness, and the deep sleep, Jagrat, Swapna, and Sushupti. Of course, there is a talk about the fourth stage as well, the Turiya, and that this Vichara is continued in the Bhashyas, Vartikas, and then Vrittis, Karikas. The whole tradition continues this discussion of consciousness, and now you can fairly understand that Western mind probably didn't get too much into the study of the dreams. Of course, there are many studies as such. So the deep sleep was also of great importance to the Vedantins. Then we have the Panchakosha Vichara from Taittiriya Samhita. We have the bodily consciousness, followed by the second, the vital sheath, the Pranamaya, and then Manomaya, Vijnanamaya, and Anandamaya, the 5 layers of human existence gets elaborately discussed in order that we understand consciousness, which is immanent. So already we are arriving at a kind of a conclusion which Vedanta holds, that the immanence is equally important as well as the transcendence. It's not transcendental in Kant's sense, it is transcendent. Not even the transcendental of the Husserl, much more than the. So Vedanta makes a distinction between what is a Purusha Tantra and what is Vastu Tantra. Purusha Tantra as the objects which depend upon my consciousness, the objects which I perceive, and then there are those categories of intellect which are also helpful in my cognition of the objects external to me. But for Vedanta, it is a Vastu Tantra. Consciousness doesn't depend upon human conceptions. Consciousness is much more than that. So, commenting on the second sutra of Brahma Sutra, after the Adhado Brahma Jignasa, we have Janmadhyasetaha, third is Shastra Yonitvat, fourth Tattva Samanvaya. On second sutra and third sutra, repeatedly Shankara refers to what is called as a Vastu Tantra. So that's the part of Vedanta methodology. It treats it as something which is foundational, something which is existing out there, which does not depend upon the categories of our intellect to understand. It's out there independent of our existence. And then the second thing generally, this talk probably, if it reaches to some of the students and scholars, the aim is that consciousness studies need to be taken up on a large scale in Indian universities. Both the models that today I would be speaking upon, actually, if one has some grasp of Sanskrit and can read the bhashyas and the text, one can take up the Vedanta studies. Of course, Nyaya Vaisheshika also has studies on consciousness. And if one doesn't, if one wants to be free from the burden of the tradition, one still can, independently take up the studies. So one general understanding of doing consciousness studies is that it's a first-person account of knowledge that we have. It's a first-person perspective, as some of you who are into phenomenological studies would be knowing. It's a subjective perspective that we have. But what I contest is, it's not just subjective, but consciousness does become an object for our study. That's the point that I keep repeating in my classes, that we can study consciousness and make it into an object. How does it become an object of our study? It does, says Shankara in Adhyasa Bhashya. Nayamatma ekantena vishayaha asmat pratyayatvad aparokshatvacha. Because of the asmat pratyaya, or the I principle, for the I, which is I am, the existential I, the vyavaharika I, it makes consciousness into an object. But that does not, please make no mistake, don't understand that consciousness is also an object. To be precise, we have in Sureshwara the Vartikatara in Naishkarmya Siddhi and other places also, including the recent Balasubramanian works also, T.M.P. Mahadevan's works. It's very clearly stated that consciousness is neither the subject nor the subject. It is much more than this dichotomy that we generally discuss. Then coming back to the contention that consciousness studies can be undertaken objectively, but then there is a footnote not in the sense of the materialist, some of the professors of the Oxford, Cambridge school, who want to study consciousness with an MRI, imaging, magnetic resonance images, or even they have the much more advanced imaging techniques that they have. Doing in Vedanta, we strongly believe that that's never going to succeed, because consciousness is the foundation of all the knowledge that we have, all cognitions that we have, and the only way to reach it is by the change of a stance, as Husserl calls it. We in Vedanta say change of drishti. From a vyavaharika drishti, there is a change of drishti towards a paramarthika. Paramarthika, paramartha, the highest object of our study, and here it is consciousness. Chit is much more loaded word than consciousness, if you may allow me to say. That's much more loaded, but this is the most appropriate word that we have. Rather, I should be using the word chit. Because as you know, the terminologies and concepts differ from each school. And so not in the sense of the materialist that we can undertake objectively. So what I started by saying that methodologies and how I must be doing is what is important in Vedanta and in Krishnamurti both. And two, that consciousness studies can also be undertaken objectively. One need not worry that it's a subjective expression and therefore there are always confusions and each one can claim to be grasping some kind of nature of consciousness. No, that's not the case. But it can't be studied objectively like we study in botany, zoology, etc., etc. And then, of course, the aim of such study is always different, as Professor Balaganapati in his last lecture with Assam University 15 days ago, he was pointing that as many philosophers, so many conceptions of philosophy. We keep on defining philosophy, and after 3 decades or so, I believe all professors keep on revisiting the very concept of philosophy. So that's the interesting part of in philosophy discipline. So the self or consciousness is grasped by the change of stance, or what we call as drishti. We have a reference to this in Katha Upanishad, Paranchikhani Vyatranat Swayambhos Tasmat Parang Pashyatina Antaratman Kasyadhiraha Avrutta Chakshuhu. Avrutta Chakshu is a redirection of our perspective, drishti, which probably has a resonance in Husserl when he talks about reduction or redirection. So does it really bring so much of a change in our understanding of consciousness? That's an interesting question to raise. The very change in the stance, it looks pretty simple, Only, I have a vyavaharika drishti in which I take the things for granted, the knowledge for granted, and by changing the stance, changing drishti, and focusing it back on consciousness, does it really have such a capacity that it brings a tremendous transformation of inner psyche or transformation of consciousness? In Vedanta school, definitely there is a reference to a kind of transformative philosophy, or what you call generally as a practicing philosophy. I do believe in such an idea of philosophy. I never believed in an armchair philosophizing, theorizing. So therefore, these schools do that. I'll now skip a couple of these slides that I have, which are actually get more into the Vedanta discussion. I want to actually jump on to Krishnamurti for today. So there, these two slides discuss about how the Chaitanya, or Sakshi Chaitanya, the conscious witness principle. All of you must be, looking at that metaphor, the imagery we have about two birds, sitting on two branches of the tree, one enjoying the fruits of, the pleasures and pains, the fruits, and then the other is a witness. that captures the whole image of the Upanishadic understanding of two principles. One, the enjoyer, the I, who is a karta and bhokta, and the other as a witness self. How do they reach towards this understanding? That's what we are discussing today, by Panchakosha Vichara and by Avasthatraya Vichara. So, the I, Sakshi Chaitanya, putting the mask of I and appropriating internal organ becomes fit enough to be related to external objects. Sureshwara commentary, Naishkarmya Siddhi, it's a story of the two birds. So this progressive fall of the self is what I have written in some of my publications. And then the next slide I discuss about the hard problem of consciousness. One is understanding the nature of the observer. That's what I will pick up when I get into Krishnamurti, to understand what is the nature of this observer. And then, of course, you have, the modern contemporary Western people talking about the experiencing self, which actually experiences the pleasures and pains. That became a hard problem. That phrase is very, difficult for a Vedantin to understand. I have not seen a Sanskrit equivalent to hard problem of consciousness, because there is no phrase for Sanskrit studies and Vedanta studies. Shankara, Ramanuja, Bhaskara, you come across them with very authentic statements, and never do you find a statement where there is a doubt regarding understanding of consciousness, or they say that something is a hard problem for them. Of course, both the issues have been phenomenally discussed in the Bhashyas. One is about the relation between the individual conscious principle and the universal, the Atman and the Brahman relation. And the second metaphysical question is, of course, the nature of liberation. Both are metaphysical questions. But in the Upanishads, if you see, it's not a metaphysical discussion that we come across. It's typically approaching consciousness studies equipped with this methodology of analysis, a rigorous analysis. And what is this method about? What is this? How to approach this method? Now, here is the methodology part of it. It goes by the name Parisankhyana model of reflection. Parisankhyana model of reflection is where it's not logical reflection. That's the contention of Vedanta. It is not logical reflection. It is not, psychic analysis, introspection, psychological introspection. No, it's not. Because what they do is, there is a distinction between jnana and dhyana, or meditation. It's not meditation also. The Vedanta method is not meditation as well. It is something like where there are two concepts to be compared, or two components to be compared. Logical reflection is what takes place. We keep comparing, contrasting. There is a logical reflection. But Parisankhyana method of Vedanta analysis is not this logical reflection. And it is not meditation as well. Why is it so? There the Shankara comes in. When there is a choice to do or not to do, doing involves action. When there is a choice, it involves action. For Vedanta, it is a choiceless awareness. Therefore, action is not involved in such an awareness. Here, the best part of Vedantic method is to be seen. Therefore, if you read Shankara's works, you would come across his critique of Jnana Karma Samuchayavada. People mistake it for criticism of karma theory, etc., which Shankara doesn't do. But what he's trying to bring in is jnana, or an awareness, is not activity. So that's the way to approach consciousness. So that's here I get reminded of J. Krishnamurti. That's how today I chose to speak. The J. Krishnamurti's works, as I said, though he doesn't actually say that he never that he read Bhagavad Gita or the Upanishads. There is a lot of similarity in this exposition of a choiceless awareness as a method of understanding consciousness. As I said, my today's talk, I'm not interested in describing the nature of consciousness, but how is it that we are approaching the studies in the context of classical Indian philosophy and in the context of contemporary thinkers as well. The next thing is, do we know anything about consciousness? What is consciousness? If we try to investigate into it, is the Brahman, which is to be investigated, known or unknown? This was a dichotomy faced by Vachaspati Mishra in Bhamati, and of course Shankara also expresses it. Do we know consciousness, or we don't know? If it is known, we need not investigate it. If it is unknown, we cannot investigate it. That was the Purva Paksha. And the answer for it could be, from the etymology of Bruha, the words eternal, pure or reached. And the existence of Brahman is demonstrated by the fact that it is the self of all. That's a kind of a psychological proof we see in Brahma Sutra commentary. We derive a universal conscious principle by looking at the demonstration of the fact that it is the self of all. For everyone assumes the existence of himself, because he cannot say, I am not. None of us say, I am not. I am not. In Shankara's Bhagavad Gita commentary, I believe it is, at least the doubting self exists. As self it is known. Then the question is, why investigate? The confusion regarding its nature continues. There are materialists on the one hand, and there are people who say it is intelligence generated by the brain. And of course, people, there are tremendous studies in neuroscience people. I don't know much about them. There are studies into philosophy of mind, tremendous studies in various directions. Most of them subscribe to some kind of a shade of materialism or other, which Vedanta doesn't do, which J. Krishnamurti does. In Vedanta, if we see, it is the Vedanta texts are used as Shabda Pramana. And of course, the methodology that I was talking, the Parisankhana reflection method, and then non-contradictory reflection. This is all the method. What I am trying to impress upon the young students and research scholars is there is an extremely worked out methodologies which are used to understand self or Brahman in Indian philosophical schools. If any of you are under the impression that you just open up an Upanishad or you make statements about consciousness, then that's what I wanted to contest. And then the second point that I wanted to keep raising was that we need to take up these studies only because, the physics people tell us 4% of the universe is known to us and 96% supposed to be the dark matter. And within this 4% that we know also, very little is known about consciousness in spite of all those works. So there is much more to contribute. If you happen to have an orientation towards these traditional classical studies, one can take it up. And of course, if you happen to have a free mind and inquire into it, here is the model, the next of J. Krishnamurti. So, in J. Krishnamurti, again, choiceless awareness is the method. If you can please read the work Freedom from the Known. And the other work that was written by Krishnamurti, very few books are written. Everything else is about talks and his dialogues. The First and Last of Freedom. There he explores into whole methodology of what is choicelessly being aware. which does not involve a choice, is to say without judging and without condemning. See, I want to draw a distinction between what is bracketing and eidetic reduction and what is choicelessly being aware. Action is not involved in this kind of a methodology. I still see bracketing or suspension as a little confusing for me, because it does not talk about a complete transformation of brain cells or consciousness, for that matter. Of course, you know the project of Husserl, which is an epistemic discourse where he has his own limitations of the purpose of doing phenomenology. But that's not the case with J.K. J.K. talks about a transformation of the brain cells and then a transformation of consciousness. Again, if the question is this the way we do philosophy? As I said, there are several conceptions of doing philosophy, and one such idea of philosophy is this from the Indian schools. So without judging and without condemning, it's not action. That's the contention. In logical reflection, I already tried to draw your attention where there are two components to be compared. So choiceless awareness is not logical reflection, not phenomenological, as I already mentioned, not linguistic analysis. I don't know much about this area, but still, I don't think that actually leads to the knowing of consciousness. The unknown consciousness is unknown, and it remains unknown. The unknowability is a strong thesis in several philosophers, but that's not the case with Vedanta. Though Krishnamurti doesn't clearly state about the transcendental principle, or what we call Brahman in Vedanta, he doesn't deny. He is very, and I want to draw your attention to Buddha also. In Nikaya literature also, if you see, on all the questions of Nagasena and others, he was silent. So the silence was interpreted as denying the metaphysical realities. I don't know if that's the correct interpretation, but in all the Nikaya literature which records the Buddha's teachings, Buddha was always silent on this question of a transcendent conscious principle. So Krishnamurti's approach also seems to be on the lines of the Buddhist philosophy. Most of the issues that he approaches have an existential import. They have the problems of the individual self, the greed, the desires, the passions, the angers, violence. All these issues draw his attention, and most of the time, for 60 decades, he was indulging in dialogues across the continents. If you look at J. Krishnamurti, I believe most of you must be aware of his works. 1895 to 1986, he was taken up by the Theosophical Society as a boy at the age of 13, and then he was declared as a world teacher. But he renounced the theosophy and any role as a world teacher in 1929. And until his death in 1986, he toured the world for 6 decades, giving public talks and interviews. And what's interesting in him is denying the notion of authority and religious matters. Classical schools of Indian philosophy, Shabda Pramana is a Pramana. And of course, they do not reach at Shabda as a Pramana, by forcing one to accept. There's a lot of thinking behind accepting Shabda as a Pramana. But J.K. denies any such authority in religious matters. And then each has to free the mind from self-imposed conditioning. That's a major theme that runs through his works. And then the talk is about conditioning by the traditions conditioning of religion, conditioning of society, conditioning of culture, of time, of gurus.
Dr. Nataraju, I'm sorry to interrupt you. You are no longer audible. Professor Nataraju.
Okay.
Maybe you have to adjust your audio. Yeah, you are not audible.
Now is it okay? Now, is it reaching now, my voice?
I can hear him.
Professor?
Yes, we can hear you.
Professor, is the voice reaching now?
You are still not audible.
Yeah.
No, you are not audible.
Dr. Singh, I think it is not audible to you, but others, I think Professor Bala and myself, we can hear.
Yeah.
Okay, am I?
Right. So this is another kind of problem.
Can I go ahead, Professor?
Yeah, we are hearing. I think the sound is very clear.
Yeah,
there must be
please
some
go
other
ahead.
problem.
Okay. Yeah. Professor Balaganpati garu?
Please go ahead, Andy.
Yeah, please.
Please.
Some 10 more minutes, sir.
Yeah, cool. If you want.
Yeah, please. Sorry for this kind of, I was just trying to introduce J. Krishnamurti for those, who are new to his works. And then, of course, I'll again get back to his method and the kind of conclusion that he arrives at. So there were several dialogues which we come across with 20th century physicist called David Bohm, who was working in quantum physics, and he wrote quantum theory to causation and chance in modern physics, and he also wrote special theory of relativity. So we come across several dialogues between these two people over 2 decades of time, and that's the kind of literature available on J. Krishnamurti. So the whole discussions revolve around understanding the role of the observer. So this observer, catches the attention of J. Krishnamurti, in terms of understanding the observer relation. What the thesis says is that the division is brought about by the kind of conditioned self that we have. In JK, we need to understand that he is not talking about the kind of Atman of the Vedanta. It's an existential self for J. Krishnamurti, and a definition of the self in J. Krishnamurti is this is how JK is defining the self for us. The self, by that, I'm quoting JK, I mean the idea, the memory, the conclusion, the experience, the various forms of nameable and unnameable intentions, the conscious endeavor to be or not to be, the accumulated memory of the unconscious, the racial, the group, the individual, the clan, and the whole of it all. The striving after all this is the self. So by now, we understand that this is not the kind of an Atman of a Vedanta. It's a kind of the I and me. Both of them actually define the self. So it's a kind of the self that we have acquired over time, over a period of time. Therefore, there is always that division which is brought forth by that. So, with the kind of the racial, individual, the group, linguistic, religious identity that the self acquires. So this kind of a solidified I or the self becomes the beginning point for all the division. That's the point that Krishnamurti is trying to make in his works. It is the beginning point which is dividing and the self enclosing, and the activities of this kind of a self are separating and isolating. Now, coming back to the methodology. So now we understand that the kind of self that Krishnamurti is trying to define is an existential self, which the embodied self, which is actually for him is the source of all conflict. So the conflict which generates division between the I and you, conflict which is there between the individual and the society, between the self and the other, the cultural other, maybe the linguistic. So that's the kind of self which is tormenting or which results in suffering. As you know, if we look at the Buddhist philosophy also, the whole idea seems to be understanding this whole notion of human suffering. And also the idea seems to be creating a kind of a painless civilization, if I can use this term. So in Krishnamurti also, it is this human suffering which is the beginning point of our philosophizing. But is this the way we in academic departments philosophize? But that's why I said, so many understandings of philosophy itself, the very conception of philosophy. So it depends on how one starts defining philosophy and how one picks up the methodology. So I was trying to, bring home the point that the extremely diligent way of working out the methodology is important for any of those students or scholars who are, listening to me today. So then the kind of conclusions one arrives at are important, because if you pick up, a phenomenological method, it has its purpose of doing it. It's mostly an epistemic endeavor, an epistemological endeavor which tries to prove consciousness as the very foundation of all knowledge that we have. So therefore, it is the strength of methodology which determines, the purpose of our philosophizing and the kind of goal that we have. And what is it that JK's goal or purpose of doing, prayojana we call it in Sanskrit. The prayojana of doing or practicing choiceless awareness seems to be that kind of a compassionate human mind. Now, end of the day, the idea is to create a human mind with brain cells transformed, or mutated, which actually generate that kind of a compassion. If I can quote for you David Bohm speaking about J. Krishnamurti's, the insight called as compassion, called love. That kind of a insight is developed by following choiceless awareness. That's the contention. Again, I want to draw a parallel. If you happen to do Radhakrishnan's intuition studies, something like that develops an intuitive knowledge, or in Krishnamurti, it is the insight. Now, the question is, are they the creations of the brain that we have? Brain, mind, some of the philosophers identify both. Some say, brain is the essence of the mind, and the others have a distinction. JK has a distinction to make. So, is this insight into the workings of nature, insight into the workings of human life, is generated by following the method of choiceless awareness. Now, is that a plausible contention, to say that something is much more than materialistic? So this kind of generating of an insight, which actually takes the form of maybe a compassion for the humanity, which is more of existence, that has a capacity to actually work upon the brain cells. That's a very interesting idea. Here I have a doubt whether, it's a kind of, it's not materialistic interpretation. It's not that the brain is generating such an insight or intuition, but it is much more, something more is actually generating such an insight. Is very contentious. I want to quote David Bohm and move towards a kind of a conclusion. Modern research, this is quote, modern research into the brain and nervous system actually gives considerable support to J.K.'s statement that insight may change the brain cells. It is now fairly established that the brain cells and their functioning are profoundly affected by knowledge and thought, especially when they give rise to strong feelings and passions. It is quite plausible that insight, which must arise in a great state of mental energy and passion, could change the brain cells in an even more profound way. That's the contention that Krishnamurti is making, and that's summed up by David Bohm, the physicist. So some of the things which I have discussed in the chapters of the book on J. Krishnamurti under Builders of Modern India series, or I raised the questions every now and then. He questions tradition and authority. Then I sometimes raise questions whether at all we do philosophy without following a tradition. Most of the time, the terminology that we use, even in the last 30 minutes that I was speaking, the terminology that I picked up is mostly from a tradition. The language that we use and the kind of a life world that we have is all a product of a tradition. Then also, he talks about that yoga is not of much help, but his choiceless method is of great help. And when we look at his life, he is an avid practitioner of yoga. Every day he used to practice asanas and pranayama. There are records for that. And then another question that I was raising in some of those chapters is, what is wrong with the tradition as long as the methodology that it is presenting and the thesis that it is presenting is not contradicting human reason, is not contradicting our understanding in present contemporary times. So I see, nothing greatly harmful in following a tradition, but yet keeping that, space within one for one's own free thinking and for one's own understanding of the problem of philosophy, whichever one takes up. So, speaking about Vedantic way of doing philosophy, and then J. Krishnamurti, they are worlds apart. I want to end with a footnote, but still, the Sakshi Bhava or Parisankhyana method and choiceless awareness method both involve a non-action. There is no action involved in both of these things. So young minds, some of the students may already get the questions as to how is it possible that we become aware and yet there is no action involved. Where actually one example that Krishnamurti gives us says something like one is observing a sunset or a sunrise. There in that moment, there is neither the observer nor the observed but just there is that observation. That observation for Krishnamurti is awareness. Then what happens is, with the passage of time, it becomes an experience, and that experience gets into memory. And those bundles of memories are what one is made up of into I and the me, which for Krishnamurti are the instruments which are divisive and separative. So that kind of an awareness, living in that kind of an awareness, is the kind of methodology that Krishnaji is proposing. So in some of those chapters, I did discuss, this book will be out maybe by next month from Munshi Ram Manohar Lal. Then probably, depending on the responses that the book has, I would further would love to look into those comments and responses once the book generates. So thank you very much, Professor Balganapati Garu and the Department of Philosophy. Maybe there is Q&A or some observations, but I really enjoyed talking to you all. Thank you. Namaste.
Thank you. Thank you. Can you hear me? Hello? Yeah. Thank you, Professor Nataraju, for this very lucid talk on understanding consciousness and Jiddu Krishnamurti. And you try to place both. You try to bring both Western and Indian conceptions together. From Indian side, both the classical and modern conceptions on consciousness, and from the Western side, you try to bring phenomenological interventions. And it was a very interesting talk that you have presented while bringing, something that is very interesting that really attracted my attention, which I would like to pursue further, is this Parisankhyana model of reflection of Shankara, and trying to relate it to choiceless awareness of Jiddu Krishnamurti. I would be really looking forward to understand this distinction and also its relation. But having said that, I'm very sure that your talk might have generated a lot of thoughts and a lot of queries as well in the minds of the participants and listeners. So without wasting much time, I invite interventions or observations or any queries that any of our students and colleagues and other researchers who are part of this audience would like to pose. I open the forum for discussion, and I think it would be good if you can pose pointed questions. I see some of the questions in the chat box, so I'll try to read those questions for you, Professor Nataraju, so that you can respond to them. In between, our other friends also would articulate their questions and pose them in the chat box. I see a question from Professor Dr. Navneet Chopra, who is asking about, can choiceless awareness be without compassion? And he also has another question, like, I mean, compassion may not always be present naturally, but be a projection. Can it be? Would you like to respond to this? Like, how do you relate this compassion to choiceless awareness? Please go ahead, Professor.
Yes. Choiceless awareness and compassion. I believe there is compassion out there. It's not that it's an altogether new faculty probably that we will develop. We cannot say that something new comes into existence, but what happens probably with choiceless awareness is that the ending of the individuation, the ending of the I happens, which, as I said, the ending of memory and the ending of the individual I and me, that ending of time, actually, it's the ending of time. It is time which has created so many memories, and therefore the ending of time actually projects the compassion on a larger scale, probably. It's not that, compassion is not built into our life. I believe so. It's there. It's there. I mean, every human seems to be compassionate in degree. There is a degree variation probably, but this oneness of the observer and observed is the truest form of compassion, probably. But I believe it's very complicated than what is being said by J.K. You know, in order to arrive at such a state, a compassionate state of heart or a mind, I believe that takes a lot. It needs tremendous energy for one to be completely aware of the whole gamut of one's own individual self, and then, you know, end all the conflict that is built into the individual self, in terms of the envy, in terms of the jealousies, in terms of the memories, the hardened self, the ending of the self. Probably that takes me towards that anatmavada of the Buddha. I don't understand Buddha's anatma as the non-existence of a conscious field out there. I understand it as the ending of this self which is divisive, the I, the empirical I, which is a midhyatma for the Vedantists.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Nataraju. Professor Shashi Motilal is asking this question, like, how would you explain logical reflection to a logician? Would you like to expand it, Professor Shashi? Or?
Yes, Madam Professor, I'm a firm believer that nobody can explain anything to these logicians, and if nobody can convince them, forget about me. I can never do that. And their firm belief in the analysis of propositions on a mathematical model, their firm belief that the reality is contained in language. We see that happening with Bhartruhari in Vakyapadiyam. I don't claim any knowledge of Vakyapadiyam, but with the kind of belief that they have, I don't think anybody can explain them what is a parisankhyana reflection, what is the logical reflection to them, the logicians at least. That's a school that contributed tremendously in Indian grammarian school also. The whole tradition of Panini's and Katyayana's commentaries, I believe. And the Western logicians, with the kind of their understanding, I don't think I have nothing to explain.
And yet you would call it logical, because is there any other way in which to explain this reflection, keeping that significance and yet avoiding the word logical, because this would consistently, this query would consistently arise, like, okay, so if somebody from the Western logical position wants to understand what is this logical reflection, is it according to certain logical principles? That is not the case. Then exactly why are we calling it logical?
Professor, this line actually is from Jane Mohanty. Jane Mohanty actually explains what logical reflection is within that phenomenological school. Mohanty's work on the possibility of transcendental subjectivity. There he was actually explaining as to by logical reflection, he means where there are two or more than two concepts to be compared, and that kind of a comparison, that kind of a reflection on these concepts is a logical reflection. But definitely within the Indian context, whether some other word can replace it, I don't know. I need to think.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Professor Nataraju. There is another question by one of our friends, Vivek Kumar Radhakrishnan. Isn't the goal of transforming human minds also conditioned? Wouldn't any goal for that matter be a part of our conditioning? Isn't choiceless awareness of Jeddu Krishnamurti opposed to having goals or purpose or vision? How do you see that?
That's an excellent critique of J. Krishnamurti. That captures actually the kind of contradiction built into Krishnamurti's teachings. The goal, he does not say that the goal is unconditioning, and it is just an awareness of understanding the whole conflict built into the individual self, and therefore the result is a free mind. But if one starts with this kind of a goal, like in Vedanta, moksha or a nirvana as a goal, definitely that's part of the conditioning already. Already one will be under tremendous psychological pressure to achieve something. That achieving something is already bringing time into our whole discussion, and that is the greatest conditioning. And if anybody wants to achieve something, that is part of conditioning. So therefore, it's only the awareness of the individual I. That's all that Krishnamurti proposes, and he avoids the words like goal of philosophy, purpose of philosophy, etc.
May I ask something? Voice is not coming.
Yes, please. Yeah, I can hear.
Hello.
Yes, please. Go ahead. I can hear.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So I had asked about this compassion. So as I understood from your talk, compassion is natural part of our being. It's not a projection. It's not a conditioning. So what will be your response? I mean, should I consider it right that it's natural part of our being? It's not conditioning.
That seems to be the work, the teachings of Krishnamurti. Yes, it is the result of the ending of the limited I and limited me. The ending results in such a state which is a very natural state of individual consciousness. Very natural state.
Yeah. So my next question is it to be attained by meditation or by some other phenomenological method like Husserl proposes, or I mean, it is to be attained by some special method, or it is naturally available to us?
For Krishnamurti, phenomenological methods goal, I don't think, is reaching towards such a state of compassion or transformation of consciousness. I did not come across such words in Husserl's book, Ideas.
Yeah.
No, that's not the goal.
Yeah. Agree. But
it has to be.
Apparently doesn't seem.
They don't fit. So it has to be
either
a Vedanta way or a Sankhya or a J. Krishnamurti way of doing, which involves the practicing of philosophical methods more than the other phenomenological method, I believe. Yeah.
So doing meditation and be watchful towards one's experiences.
You're a scholar, but meditation, as I actually said in the beginning of this talk, dhyana or concentration does involve some human action. And it does help an individual, because in yoga also, asana, pranayama, dharana, dhyana, samadhi, those models are acceptable to yoga, and it is acceptable to Vedanta. Dhyana Shabda is there in Upanishads in several places. But that's not choiceless awareness. Dhyana does help one, but still what Krishnaji says is, if you are meditating, still you are forcing the individual mind on to concentrate on something. any such force applied is action, human action. If human action is involved, the awareness is not there. So it's much more than dhyana, but still dhyana definitely has a place in our endeavor, I believe. But it is much more. In Vedanta also, it is much more than meditation, because action should not be there. Because the moment there is an action involved, there is a dichotomy between the observer and what is observed, the subject and the object. That dichotomy is divisive.
Yeah, that's fine. That might be the beginning transient stage, and then one reaches to the samadhi state, then there is no division between subject and the world. So maybe at that stage that samadhi stage is equivalent to choiceless awareness.
I actually at this point I can't answer, because I need to again refer back to what is Ashtadhyayi. Patanjali is talking exactly about a samadhi state, because samprajnatas are there. Whether that samadhi can be actually compared with this, no, I need to refer back again. Sorry, I mean Ashtanga Yoga.
Okay. In fact, even in ordinary everyday experience, he thinks it is possible to experience choiceless awareness. That's why he was giving the example of observing nature as a beautiful scenery or something.
But would that be
where there is awareness and compassion, but there is no action on the part of the individual, right? So there are various instances where we do experience choiceless awareness in our life. So probably he is referring to that. I'm sorry, I lost my connectivity in between, so I lost my chat box as well, which means I don't know what are the questions that were posed later on. If somebody would like to help me, Dr. Ravi, would you be...
Professor Nataraju, in the context of Dr. Chopra's question that you were replying to just now, I wanted to, if even meditative state is or meditative practice is considered as some kind of an action, then is Krishnamurti in some senses recommending free association of sorts, or you can say open awareness meditation to let thoughts, emotional states, affective states basically come and go, and you just remain a kind of a disinterested observer? Is there something of that kind that Krishnamurti is recommending?
Yes, Professor. I mean, what he is trying to say is there is something phenomenal happening in an intense awareness, without judging and without condemning any state of our conscious existence. Something phenomenal is taking place. That actually ends all the individuation, the I, with all its memories and time. So that ending of all memory, the ending of the past, happens in that awareness. That's the basic method. Yes, but how long one can hold on to that awareness, as we all know, I mean, immediately the next moment there is a division between the observer and observed, and that awareness is lost. But for moments, I believe, I agree with Professor Balaganpati that we do have such experiences where the thought is not functioning, where time sense is lost, and just there is that observation. Probably that's what JK is trying to say.
Dr. Chopra, could you mute yourself, please?
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Is Professor Balaganpati audible to you? the audience? At least I'm not able to hear him.
No, I can't hear him. I can't hear him. Yeah.
Yeah. Professor Bala, we can't hear you.
I can see him, but I can't.
Yeah.
I can only see him. Professor Balganpati, there are around 35 comments here. And
yeah, please, Prof Nataraju, I would request that you look at the chat box and you can reply from your own side, on your own.
Okay.
Yeah, please. Thank you.
That I can do. Yeah,
thank you.
Next, do I have another 5-6 minutes? I have time? Some more?
Yes, you have more time. You have.
Yes.
I think there is one gentleman, Varun Vigmal, who has been asking questions. Maybe you can look at his questions because he's bringing in Varela and Ivan Thompson as well as Chalmers to this discussion.
Oh, yes. How is JK work different from Thompson and embodied mind and denounce objective analysis of concepts? Yes, analysis of consciousness and denounce object. Yes, Varun. I mean that I tried to answer in the very beginning of this talk. That objective analysis of when I say the objective analysis of consciousness in Vedanta, there is a tradition of treating it as an object. That does not mean, I again underline, because this is the understanding of Thompson or Zahavi or Mohanty. When I said objective way of understanding consciousness, I did not mean that consciousness becomes an object. No, not in that sense. But what I said is, as long as we hold on to an empirical I, the self with all its envy, greed, and the desires and knowledge, as long as we hold on to it, it makes consciousness into an object. So therefore, we can treat it consciousness as an object in that sense, only for the sense of I that I have, and then start studying. But at the end of the day, when one reaches a kind of a condition like compassion, etc., there is neither the subject nor the object. So none of these works of phenomenologists reach a level of talking about a transformation of brain cells, transformation of individual consciousness, and the beginnings of a compassion. None of the phenomenologists speak about it. And the one reason that I see is it's the kind of limitation of the methodology that they have. The methodology of bracketing, the methodology of eidetic reduction, and the very project of philosophical inquiry of Husserl was not trying to, transform the individual life here and now. It was a limited project that they had, though extremely significant and though extremely brilliant work that one can come across in Husserl. But that's not more than going beyond an epistemic discourse of understanding cognition, perception. You have cognitive phenomenology, you have neurophenomenology. In all these cases, again, the end goal is not completely ending of the individual I. It's only bracketing or suspension for time being. I'm not completely happy whether this method ever can take one more than what is that transcendental subject. Even transcendental subjectivity was a huge issue of discussion and was not acceptable to followers of Husserl. Richard Rorty uses a beautiful phrase, heretical followers, because none of them seem to be following the pure phenomenology method of Husserl. That's how it is. But JK, I believe, has much more scope in terms of his methodology. That looks more sophisticated and is very, very nearer to the Vedanta methods, though there are differences. Thank you.
Professor Nataraju, a little, I would like to
There is a question by Gautam. There is a question by Gautam.
Yes, yes.
And it says, how would Vedanta account for reductive accounts of consciousness as given by neurosciences? Since there is no empirical evidence too of consciousness existing apart from human body, is there a commonality between Advaita and neuroscience as per you? I don't claim to be really knowledgeable about neuroscience, except understanding that the neurons, the tiniest of those, may contain a billion chambers within them, and those chambers again, may give us an answer to the very nature of consciousness. So I see a methodological difference between these two methodologies of Vedanta and the neuroscience. I just don't denounce anything the neuroscience is doing. Obviously, the very serious people out there with well-equipped methodologies, we need to respect their tremendous work that they do. But again, as I said, approaching consciousness with any empirical way of doing it. Husserl calls it the natural attitude, as you know. Those 5 lectures which Husserl gave at Heidelberg University, the natural method is never going to capture consciousness, number one. And proving consciousness to us is not possible, is what you are saying. But I gave one argument while I was doing Vedanta portion that, see, our own existence and which undeniable existence, our own self itself is a proof of that greater existence for Vedantins. We don't deny and we don't say, I am not. That itself is a proof for the individual existence. And the sum total of all that existence, has come out of existence. That's the contention of Brahma Sutra. The first Adhyaya, the entire Adhyaya, with the first 50 to 60 sutras, try to say that this existence, our individual existence, must have come out of existence. It wouldn't have come out of material particles, Paramanus. It wouldn't have come out of non-existence. It wouldn't have come out of void, Shunyata, is the contention of the Vedanta. So the methodologically they are different fields, and therefore the conclusions would also differ, though I claim no real knowledge of neuroscience. Next question is by Kanika Gupta, who actually is trying to compare, is JK's choiceless awareness topic has anything to do, has he got inspired from Ritambhara Prajna of Patanjali Yoga Sutras? Ritambhara Prajna, absolutely. I mean, though JK never accepted any of this, JK always kept saying that I did not read Bhagavad Gita, I did not read Upanishads or Yoga Sutras. I doubt, really I doubt. Ritambhara Prajna is also a Prajna which is the result of an intelligence. JK continuously talks about the origination of such an intelligence by the ending of the individual I and me. Ritambhara Prajna is also a result of ending of that empirical existence, which is divisive, which is a product of culture, society, religion, and the conditioning. Definitely, after the asana pranayama pratyahara dharana dhyanas, they do lead to a kind of a prajna or an intelligence which is comparable to the insight as spoken by JK. I agree with you on this.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Nataraju. I hope I'm audible now, right?
Yes,
yes, you are audible.
Yeah, great. Because I switched to my mobile because there is some problem with the laptop. I believe I was not getting connected, and my voice was not audible. So, yeah, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, as well as responding to all the queries as far as possible, and trying to address their concerns. Thank you so much, and I'm very sure your talk and your responses to the concerns that our audience have raised definitely encourage some of our students and researchers to go further on studying or having a look at the studies of the works of Jiddu Krishnamurti, and also getting into consciousness studies as they are available in Indian tradition, and trying to look at the methodologies which you have been stressing from the beginning, that we have different methodologies, and the Indian methodologies are still to be unexplored, and these are to be addressed properly. Thank you so much for such a wonderful talk and responses to the students, and I look forward to our future interactions. Thank you so much to you. And I also thank Dr. Ravi for facilitating this event, and also I thank all my colleagues and research scholars for joining us and participating in the event and making it vibrant.
Thank you, Professor Balaganpati Garu and the department. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.
We'll be in touch.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you.
Professor Shashiji, thank you.